Welcome, welcome, dear friends. Pull your blanket a little closer tonight because the story I'm about to tell you is one of the most haunting, the most heartbreaking, and in the strangest way, one of the most deeply human stories you will ever hear. We're going back to the year 1348, and I want you to imagine something with me for just a moment. You wake up one morning and your neighbour's house is quiet. Too quiet. The dog that always barked at dawn silent. You step outside and the street that should smell like bread baking and wood smoke instead smells like something you have never smelled before. Something you cannot name. Something you never want to smell again. This is what it was like to live in Siena, Italy in the summer of 1348. And what happened there was so devastating, so complete, so utterly final, that the city never fully recovered. Not in decades, not in centuries, in some ways not even today. So tonight let us walk those empty streets together. Let us understand not just what happened, but what it felt like to be one of the people who lived through it. Because history is not just dates and numbers. History is people. Real people. People who loved their children, who had favourite foods, who argued with their neighbours over fences. And in 1348, those people faced something that no amount of prayer, no amount of medicine, no amount of running could stop. Siena in the mid-14th century was one of the most beautiful, most ambitious cities in all of Europe. The people of Siena were building something extraordinary. A cathedral so grand, so breathtaking in its scale, that it was meant to dwarf every other church on the continent. Construction had been underway for years. The walls were rising. The columns were being carved. Artists were being commissioned. The whole city buzzed with pride and purpose. And then in the late spring of 1348, the ships arrived in the Italian ports. They came from the east. These merchant vessels loaded with silk and spices and something else entirely, something invisible, something carried in the blood of rats, in the bite of fleas too small to see with the naked eye. The disease that we now call the bubonic plague had already torn through Asia, already devastated the Mongol Empire, already left entire villages empty from China to the Black Sea. And now it had found its way to Europe. The symptoms came quickly and they were unmistakable. First a fever that burned so hot it felt like the inside of a furnace. Then the swellings, what people called buboes, painful lumps the size of eggs that appeared in the armpits, the groin, the neck. The skin turned black in patches. Bleeding occurred beneath the skin. The suffering lasted on average between 2 and 4 days. After that, in most cases, there was nothing. Modern historians estimate that the plague killed somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people across Eurasia over the following decades. In Europe alone, roughly 1/3 of the entire population was gone within just a few years. Let that sink in for a moment. 1 out of every 3 people, entire generations, entire families wiped out in a matter of weeks. But Siena was hit with a particular ferocity. A man named Agnolo di Tura lived in Siena during those months. He was a notary, an ordinary man, someone whose job was to record facts and transactions. And he did record them with a kind of stunned, almost disbelieving grief that reaches across 700 years and grabs you by the collar. In his chronicle he wrote that the pestilence killed so many people that everyone thought it was the end of the world. He wrote that he buried his 5 children with his own hands. 5 children. With his own hands, because there was no one left to help him. Historians estimate that Siena lost between 50 and 60% of its population in a single year. Some accounts suggest the number was even higher in certain neighbourhoods. Streets that had been alive with merchants, children, priests and craftsmen became corridors of silence almost overnight. Homes stood open their doors, swinging in the summer breeze because there was no one left to close them. Here is something that stops me every time I think about it. Because of the plague, the construction of Siena's great cathedral, That magnificent soaring dream in marble stopped completely, and it never restarted. The money was gone, the workers were gone, the ambition in many ways was gone, and if you visit Siena today you can still see the unfinished walls of what would have been the nave of that cathedral. They call it the facciatone, the big facade. Oh, these walls just stand there open to the sky, leading nowhere. A monument not to what was built, but to what was interrupted, to everything that was lost. I think about that cathedral often. It was meant to be the greatest building in Christendom, and it became instead the most eloquent ruin in Europe. A city's ambition frozen in stone at the exact moment the world fell apart. Now here is the part of this story that most history books skip over, and I think it is the most important part of all. What happened to the people who survived? Living through the plague was in many ways its own kind of suffering. Survivors found themselves in a world that had been fundamentally rearranged. Social structures that had held for centuries the feudal hierarchy, the guild systems, the church's authority, were all shaken to their foundations. Why? Because death had not discriminated. Nobles died as readily as servants. Bishops died as readily as street sweepers. Priests who administered last rites died within days of giving them. The old certainties that your place in society was fixed, that God's order was just and comprehensible, those certainties were now deeply, painfully in question. Survivors also face something that psychologists today would recognize immediately: profound collective trauma. An entire population of people who had watched their families die, who'd been forced to abandon the sick out of fear of contagion, who had carried bodies to mass graves because individual burials were no longer possible. One account from Florence, Siena's rival city just 50 miles to the north, describes bodies being layered into trenches like lasagna. The chronicler used that exact comparison as dark a piece of Italian humour as you will ever encounter, each layer of bodies covered with a thin layer of earth, and then more bodies on top. The trauma reshaped the culture of the entire region for generations. Art changed. The paintings and frescoes produced in Italy after the Black Death became noticeably more focused on death skeletons, decaying bodies, the fragility of human life. Scholars call this the danse macabre, the dance of death, a motif that appeared across European art and literature in the decades following the plague. It was as if an entire civilization had been forced to look directly at its own mortality and could not stop thinking about it afterward. And yet, and I find this truly remarkable, life continued. Siena did not disappear. People returned. Children were born. The markets reopened. The artists kept painting. The cathedral, though never completed as planned, still stands today as one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. The people of Siena, those who survived, did what human beings have always done in the face of unimaginable loss. They kept going. There is a lesson in that, I think, that is more valuable than any political history, more enduring than any king's story. The lesson is simply this: that human resilience is not a comfortable, inspirational thing. It is not a poster on a motivational speaker's wall. It is something that emerges from the deepest suffering forged in grief and silence, and the simple, stubborn refusal to stop existing. The people of Siena did not bounce back. They carried their losses with them, but they carried them forward. And speaking of carrying things forward, if you think Siena in 1348 was the worst place in old Europe, I want you to hold that thought. Because what comes next is a kind of misery that is not dramatic or sudden. It is slow. It is daily. It is wet. It is something that seeps into your bones and never quite leaves. We're going to talk about what it meant to build your life on a swamp, to wake up every morning knowing that the ground beneath your feet was not solid, that the water you drank could kill you just as easily as the water that threatened to swallow your home. And the people who did this and why they had no choice, it is a story that will surprise you more than you might expect. So stay close, we are just getting started. Now before we go any further, I want to ask you something honest. Have you ever lived somewhere that felt like it was actively trying to get rid of you? Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense, not a haunted house or a war zone, but in that slow, grinding, everyday way where the environment itself just seems indifferent to your survival, where the weather, the ground, the water, everything around you is simply not interested in whether you make it. Because if Sienna showed us what sudden, catastrophic loss looks like, what comes next is an entirely different kind of suffering. The kind that does not announce itself with fever and swelling. The kind that just seeps into your life season by season, year by year, until you almost forget that other people just a few miles away, are living something completely different. We are heading to the marshes now. Specifically, we're going to the wetlands of medieval England, a vast waterlogged region in the east of the country known as the Fens, and then briefly we will stop in the lagoons of northern Italy, where another group of people made a choice so counterintuitive, so seemingly irrational, that historians are still arguing about exactly why they did it. The Fens in the medieval period covered roughly 1,500 square miles of eastern England, parts of what are now Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire and Norfolk. To put that in perspective, that is an area roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island, entirely submerged, partially submerged, or perpetually at risk of flooding, depending on the season and the whim of whatever storm had rolled in from the North Sea that week. People lived here, thousands of them. Generation after generation, they built their homes on little islands of slightly higher ground connected to each other by wooden causeways and flat-bottom boats. They ate eel, enormous quantities of eel, so much so that rents and taxes in the Fens were sometimes paid not in silver but in eels. The Domesday Book, that extraordinary survey of England commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, records that certain Fenland estates owed their lords tens of thousands of eels per year as part of their annual dues. Tens of thousands. Just eels. Which honestly I find equal parts impressive and deeply sad. But here is what the Domesday Book does not tell you. It does not tell you what it smelled like in August when the standing water had been baking in the summer heat for months, and every breath tasted faintly of rot. It does not tell you about the mosquitoes, clouds of them, so thick in warm weather that livestock sometimes suffocated, their airways blocked by the sheer volume of insects. And it does not tell you about the fevers. The medieval English called it the ague. We would call it malaria. Yes, malaria. In England, it sounds almost impossible today, but the Anopheles mosquito thrived in the shallow, warm, stagnant waters of the Fens for centuries, and it carried Plasmodium vivax with it, a strain of malaria that is generally less fatal than its African cousin, but is absolutely miserable in every other respect. Recurring fevers, chills that rattle your entire body, sweat so intense the bedding has to be wrung out, and then a brief remission, a few good days where you think maybe it is over, and then it comes back again, and again, and again. Some Fenland residents spent years in this cycle, their bodies slowly worn down, their ability to work and farm and simply function gradually eroded. Life expectancy in the Fens was noticeably lower than in drier parts of England. Children born in the marshes faced mortality rates that would horrify any modern parent, and yet families stayed. Why? This is the question that genuinely fascinates me about this period, and I think it reveals something profound about how human beings make decisions when their options are constrained in ways we can barely imagine today. The answer is not that Fenland people were stubborn or ignorant. The answer is that for many of them leaving was simply not possible, and for others the Fens actually offered something that drier land did not. Here is the thing about a swamp that most people do not consider a swamp is hard to govern. Roads do not exist. Armies cannot move easily through it. Tax collectors find it deeply inconvenient. The same terrain that made life miserable for the people living there also made it genuinely difficult for lords, bishops and kings to reach them and enforce their demands. For serfs, people who are legally bound to their lord's land and required to hand over a portion of everything they produced, the fens represented a kind of accidental freedom. You might be feverish and smelling of eel, but at least nobody owned you outright. There were also monks. Extraordinary, eccentric, possibly slightly unhinged monks who looked at the most forbidding swamps in England and saw in them the perfect location for a monastery. The reasoning was theological isolation from worldly temptation, but the practical consequences were significant. Institutions like Ely Crowland and Thorney became centres of scholarship, agriculture and community that anchored the fenland settlements and provided occasional access to rudimentary medical care. The monks drained small areas around their foundations, grew crops, kept records, and in doing so inadvertently made the marshes marginally more livable for the communities around them. Not comfortable, marginally more livable. There is a difference. Now let me take you slightly south and east across the Alps to a lagoon on the northeastern coast of Italy. Because what happened in the Venetian lagoon is the fenland story taken to its most extreme and ultimately most extraordinary conclusion. The people who founded Venice, the original settlers in the 5th and 6th centuries, were refugees. They were fleeing the chaos that followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and later the invasions of the Lombards from the north. Faced with the choice between remaining on the mainland and being conquered or killed, and retreating into the barely habitable islands of a tidal lagoon, they chose the lagoon. And in doing so, they chose a place where the ground itself was not solid, where every building had to be constructed on wooden piles driven down through the mud and into the compressed clay below, where the water that surrounded them was brackish, too salty to drink, not salty enough to preserve food properly, where flooding was seasonal, predictable, and completely unstoppable, where the air in summer hummed with insects and the smell of the tidal flats at low tide was, by all historical accounts, absolutely extraordinary in the worst possible sense. Early medieval Venice was not the golden city of gondolas and palaces that tourists visit today. Early medieval Venice was a collection of wooden huts on islands, connected by rickety bridges populated by fishermen and salt traders who lived short, difficult, disease-prone lives. Infant mortality was brutal. Fresh water had to be collected from rain in specially designed cisterns because the lagoon water would make you ill, and the nearest rivers were miles away on the mainland. Wood rot was a constant enemy. Fire, paradoxically, was also a constant enemy, because although they were surrounded by water, the structures were built of wood and packed closely together, and a fire could devastate an entire district before the water could be put to any useful purpose. Here is something that I think deserves a moment of quiet appreciation. Those early Venetians, the ones living in the wooden huts, drinking rainwater, sweating through malarial summers, they made a choice to stay. And their children made the same choice, and their children's children. And somewhere along the way, across generations of stubbornness and ingenuity, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to be beaten by a lagoon, those wooden huts became stone palaces, those rickety bridges became the Rialto, those fishermen's children became merchants whose trade network stretched from England to China. Venice in the 14th and 15th centuries was arguably the wealthiest city in the world. Its art, its architecture, its system of government, a republic, not a monarchy, at a time when that was almost unheard of in Europe. All of this grew directly out of that original, desperate, seemingly insane decision to live in a swamp. I'm not saying that suffering is always generative. It is not. Most of the time, suffering is just suffering, and we should not romanticize it. The Fenland families who died of malaria in their 40s were not secretly building towards something greater. They were just people who did not get to live long enough. But Venice is a useful reminder that the conditions that make a place miserable can sometimes also be the conditions that force a kind of creativity and resilience that more comfortable environments never produce. You build differently when the ground cannot hold you. You think differently when nobody can reach you to tell you what to do. You cooperate differently when the water that threatens you does not care which family you belong to. And speaking of people who are forced to cooperate or perish, the next chapter of this journey takes us underground entirely, down into darkness that most of us will never have to know, down into the tunnels where children worked by the light of a single candle, where the rock dust settled into their lungs long before anyone thought to give it a name, and where the value of what they pulled out of the earth stood in almost grotesque contrast to the lives they lived pulling it. The mine towns of medieval Europe are waiting, and I promise you this one is going to stay with you. Let me paint you a picture. It is 3 a.m. The village is still dark, still cold, the kind of cold that has no interest in your comfort whatsoever. And a child, let us say he is 7 years old, maybe 8, is already awake. Not because someone dragged him out of bed, but because this is simply what morning means in his world. He has never known a morning that was any different. He pulls on clothes that smell of rock dust, and old sweat eats whatever is left from the night before, if anything is left at all, and walks with his father down a path that leads not toward fields or a market or a school, but toward a hole in the ground. A literal hole in the ground. And he goes in. This was not an exceptional childhood in the mining communities of medieval Europe. This was Tuesday. This was every day. And if you think that sounds like the setup for a story about injustice and outrage, well, yes, it is. But it is also something more complicated than that. Because the people who sent their children into those tunnels were not monsters. They were families doing exactly what the economic structure of their world demanded of them, in a system so thoroughly designed against them that individual choices barely registered as choices at all. The silver mines of the Harz Mountains in central Germany were among the most productive and most punishing in all of medieval Europe. Mining in this region dates back to at least the 10th century, when the Saxon emperors discovered that the mountains were rich with silver ore and decided with the enthusiasm that rulers tend to bring to the discovery of other people's wealth, that this ore needed to come out of the ground immediately and in large quantities. Towns grew up around the mines, Goslar being the most famous functioning as an imperial residence, precisely because of its proximity to the silver that bankrolled much of the Holy Roman Empire's ambitions. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Goslar was by medieval standards a genuinely important city. It had a palace, it had churches, it had markets, and it had mines that were worked without interruption by men and boys who spent their entire productive lives underground. Here is something I want you to really think about for a moment, because I think it gets lost when we talk about medieval mining in broad historical strokes. The tunnels in these early mines were extraordinarily narrow. This was not an engineering choice so much as a practical one. The narrower the tunnel, the less rock you had to remove to reach the ore, and the narrowest tunnels, the ones that threaded deepest into the mountain along the veins of silver, were simply too small for an adult body to fit through. This is why children worked in the mines, not incidentally, not as a last resort, structurally. Children were a necessary part of the labour system because their small bodies could go where adult bodies could not. Boys as young as 6 or 7 were employed, and I use that word loosely since the concept of voluntary employment in this context is doing a great deal of heavy lifting as trappers and hurriers. And trappers sat alone in the dark for hours, sometimes entire shifts operating ventilation doors that controlled the airflow through the tunnels. Hurriers pushed and pulled carts of ore through passages so low they had to crawl, their backs pressed against the ceiling, their knees raw on the rock floor. They worked by the light of tallow candles, animal fat candles that produced a dim guttering flame and a steady stream of black smoke in an enclosed space with limited air circulation. The combination of poor ventilation candle smoke and the fine dust released by breaking ore created an atmosphere that was over time quietly catastrophic for human lungs. Medieval miners did not have a name for what we now call silicosis, the progressive irreversible scarring of lung tissue caused by inhaling silica dust. They just knew that miners coughed, that miners got short of breath young, that miners as a category of person did not tend to live long lives. Historical records from mining communities in the Harz region and in Cornwall, England, where tin mining had been practiced since the Bronze Age and continued intensively through the medieval period, consistently show average life expectancies for adult male miners running somewhere between 35 and 45 years. That is not old age. That is middle age by our standards. And that shortened lifespan was not primarily from accidents, though accidents were certainly common enough: tunnel collapses, flooding, falls, tools slipping in the dark. It was primarily from the cumulative effect of breathing bad air in an enclosed space year after year from childhood onward. The tin mines of Cornwall are a fascinating and heartbreaking parallel to the German silver mines, because they developed in relative isolation separated from the Harz region by the entire width of Europe, and yet arrived at almost identical conditions through the same economic logic. Cornwall's tin was enormously valuable. It was essential for making bronze used across Europe and beyond for tools, weapons, and decorative objects. The Cornish tin trade connected England to Mediterranean markets that stretched as far as the ancient Phoenicians, and in the medieval period it made certain Cornish landowners extraordinarily wealthy. The miners themselves rather less so. A Cornish tin miner in the 13th or 14th century typically worked under a system called tribute, where he and his small team would negotiate with the mine owner for the right to work a particular section of the mine in exchange for a percentage of the ore they extracted. In theory, this gave miners some autonomy and the possibility of a good return if they struck a rich vein. In practice, mine owners set the tribute rates, controlled access to equipment and supplies, and had every structural advantage in the negotiation. A run of poor ore, an unexpected flooding, and illness that took a man off work for 2 weeks. Any of these could tip a tribute miner and his family from subsistence into genuine crisis. And then there was the matter of what mining actually did to a community, not just to individual bodies, but to the social fabric of the place. Mining towns were by their nature almost entirely dependent on a single industry that could be and frequently was abruptly exhausted. A seam of ore that had sustained a community for 3 generations could run out without warning, leaving hundreds of families in a settlement built around nothing but the mine with no obvious alternative. The forests that once surrounded mining communities were frequently clear-cut to provide timber for pit props and charcoal for smelting, leaving landscapes that were by the end of intensive mining almost lunar in their desolation. Streams ran orange and copper-coloured from mineral runoff. Fields near smelting operations failed to grow crops because the soil was contaminated. The community had, in its desperation to extract value from the earth, methodically destroyed the environmental conditions that might have sustained any alternative way of life. There is a word for this dynamic that economists use today: a resource curse. The idea that communities and countries sitting atop enormous natural wealth sometimes end up worse off than their neighbours precisely because that wealth distorts everything around it. The economy, the politics, the environment, the social structure. Medieval mining towns did not have economists to give this phenomenon a name, but they lived it in the most visceral and literal sense. What moves me most when I read through the historical accounts of these communities, and they are fragmentary because miners did not often leave written records, they were generally not taught to read or write, is the evidence of what persisted alongside the hardship. The folk songs, the particular saints that mining communities adopted as their patrons. Saint Barbara in the German tradition, Saint Piran in Cornwall, who is still the patron saint of tin miners, and whose flag, a white cross on a black background meant to evoke tin ore gleaming against black rock, is still the flag of Cornwall today. The rituals that miners developed around the start of a shift, the prayer said, before descending the small superstitions that accumulated in communities where the margin between coming home and not coming home was on any given day uncomfortably thin. These rituals were not naive. They were not evidence that medieval miners were too ignorant to understand that their patron saint could not actually stop a tunnel from collapsing. They were evidence that human beings faced with conditions they cannot control reach for meaning and community and shared practice because those things are real, even when the danger is also real. That impulse to build culture in the darkest, most constrained circumstances is something we are going to encounter again and again as we continue this journey through the most difficult places in old Europe. But the next place we visit is darker in a different way. Because in the mine, at least, the danger was geological, indifferent. The rock did not choose its victims. What happened in the walled quarters of medieval Europe's Jewish communities was not indifferent at all. It was deliberate. It was sustained. And it was carried out by the neighbours, sometimes by people who had grown up on the same street, bought bread from the same baker, attended festivals together in better years. That story deserves to be told carefully, so let us take a breath, and then we will go there together. There is a particular kind of cruelty that does not announce itself with a sword or a torch. It arrives quietly dressed in paperwork, in laws, in ordinances passed by city councils on ordinary afternoons, while the sun was still shining and birds were still singing outside the chamber windows. It arrives as a line drawn on a map, here you may live and here you may not. And once that line is drawn, generations of people find their entire world compressed into a few narrow streets, a handful of buildings, a sky visible only in rectangles above the rooftops. This is the story of medieval Europe's Jewish quarters, and I want to tell it carefully because it is not simply a story of victimhood, though the suffering was real and devastating. It is also, and this is what most people miss entirely, a story of extraordinary cultural resilience, of a community that built schools, libraries, courts of law, and a rich intellectual life inside the very walls designed to contain and diminish them. But we should not skip past the walls. We need to understand what those walls actually meant. The history of Jewish communities in medieval Europe is long and complicated, stretching back to the Roman period. By the early Middle Ages, Jewish merchants and scholars had established communities in cities across the continent, in the Rhine Valley of what is now Germany, along the trade routes of France, in the cities of northern Italy and the Iberian Peninsula. These were for periods relatively integrated communities. Jewish doctors treated Christian patients. Jewish merchants traded alongside Christian ones. There were tensions certainly and periodic outbreaks of violence, but for stretches of the early medieval period, coexistence was a working reality. Then the First Crusade happened, in 1096. The armies gathering to march to the Holy Land needed, it seemed, to work up some enthusiasm before departure, and in city after city along the Rhine, in Speyer, in Worms, in Mainz, that enthusiasm expressed itself in massacres of local Jewish communities. The logic, such as it was, ran something like this: why travel all the way to Jerusalem to fight the enemies of Christianity, when the enemies of Christianity are living right here in our city? Historians estimate that somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 Jewish people were killed in the Rhineland alone during those months of 1096. This was not the beginning of anti-Semitism in Europe, but it was a turning point. The violence of the Crusades, repeated and amplified across the following centuries, drove a permanent wedge into whatever fragile coexistence had previously existed. And out of that wedge grew the ghetto. The word itself, ghetto, comes from Venice, specifically from a small island in the northern part of the Venetian lagoon called the Ghetto Nuovo, the new foundry, because a copper foundry had once operated there. In 1516, the Venetian government decreed that all Jewish residents of the city must live on this island. The bridges connecting it to the rest of Venice were locked at night. Guards were posted. The island was enclosed by walls, and the walls had gates, and the gates were controlled entirely by the city's Christian authorities. 1516. That is the formal beginning of the ghetto as an institution. But the reality of forced segregation had existed in various forms across Europe for much longer. In Frankfurt, Germany, the Judengasse, the Jews' Lane, had confined the city's Jewish community to a single narrow street since the 12th century. At its fullest extent, this street was roughly a quarter of a mile long and perhaps 12 feet wide in places. Imagine a street barely wide enough for two carts to pass each other, lined on both sides with buildings that grew taller and taller as the population increased, and there was nowhere else to expand except upward. Can you picture the A street no wider than a large hallway, buildings 5 and 6 stories tall leaning over it until sunlight reached the ground only for a brief window around midday? And into this street by the 17th century were crammed somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 people. For comparison, that density would rival the most overcrowded neighbourhoods of Victorian London or 19th century New York. The consequences were predictable. Fires were catastrophic. In 1711, a fire in the Frankfurt Judengasse destroyed the homes of nearly the entire community, leaving hundreds of families suddenly without shelter. Epidemics moved through the quarter with terrible efficiency, because the population density made containment essentially impossible. During plague years, and this is one of the most painful ironies of this entire history, the Jewish communities who were already confined, already separated from the broader city, were frequently blamed for the plague itself. The accusation spread across Europe in the 1340s that Jewish people had poisoned the wells, triggering a wave of massacres that historians call the Rindfleisch pogroms, and later the Black Death pogroms. In some cities, the Jewish community was entirely eliminated before the plague even arrived. In Strasbourg, in 1349, approximately 2,000 Jewish residents were burned alive, and this was before the Black Death had reached Strasbourg. The accusation, in other words, preceded the disease. I find myself sitting with that fact for a moment every time I encounter it. People were killed to prevent a disaster that had not yet happened. This is the logic of scapegoating taken to its most extreme conclusion, and it is a pattern that has repeated itself throughout human history with a consistency that should deeply trouble all of us. And yet inside these walls something remarkable was happening. The Jewish communities of medieval Europe were by a significant margin the most literate population on the continent. This was not coincidence. Jewish religious practice required the ability to read the Torah, the Talmud, the prayer books, while rates of literacy in Christian Europe hovered somewhere around 10% of the total population. For most of the medieval period, literacy within Jewish communities was dramatically higher, encompassing both men and, unusually for the era, many women. The Judengasse in Frankfurt, that impossibly cramped street, was home to scholars whose intellectual output shaped European philosophy for centuries. Moses Mendelssohn, the 18th century philosopher who essentially founded the Jewish Enlightenment movement, grew up in a world shaped directly by the ghetto experience. The Rothschild banking family, whose financial influence would eventually span the entire continent, began as a small merchant family in that same narrow Frankfurt street. The compressed, surveilled, legally constrained world of the ghetto somehow produced people of enormous intellectual and economic capability, and I think the reason for this is not despite the constraints, but in some complex way because of them. When you're excluded from most professions, and Jewish people in medieval Europe were legally excluded from landowning, from most guilds, and from most civic life, you develop expertise in the fields that remain open. finance, medicine, philosophy, and scholarship became not just professions but survival strategies. When your community's legal standing can be revoked at any moment by the whim of a prince or a bishop, internal community institutions, courts, schools, charitable organizations become not just desirable, but absolutely essential. The walls, in other words, produced a community that was turned intensely inward, and that inward turning generated a depth of intellectual and cultural life that continues to shape the world today. I want to be precise here, though, because I do not want to fall into the trap of making oppression sound accidentally beneficial. The people who died in the pogroms did not benefit from anything. The families whose homes burned in Frankfurt's fires did not secretly gain strength from their losses. The children who grew up knowing that they were legally other permanently suspect confined by law to a street their neighbours could leave freely. Those children paid a real price, a price measured in anxiety and grief, and diminished possibility that no amount of subsequent cultural achievement can fully redeem. What we can say carefully and with full acknowledgement of the suffering involved is that the communities themselves found ways to sustain meaning and dignity and intellectual vitality in conditions specifically designed to prevent exactly that. And that is worth understanding not as inspiration, it is not an inspiration story, but as a historical fact about human beings that matters. The legal emancipation of Jewish communities across Europe came slowly, unevenly, and incompletely beginning in France after the Revolution of 1789, spreading fitfully across the continent through the 19th century. Frankfurt's Judengasse was demolished in the early 19th century as emancipation arrived. The Venetian ghetto's gates were opened in 1797 when Napoleon's forces entered the city. Generations of families walked out through these gates into a wider world, but the walls of the ghetto, even after the physical walls came down, left marks that lasted far longer than anyone anticipated. Because the experience of enforced segregation does not simply end when the law changes. The trauma, the habits of community building, the deep suspicion of institutions designed by and for others, these things persist. They shape how a community sees itself and how it moves through the world. And this brings us in a way that I think you will find unexpected to our next destination. Because we have been talking about confinement imposed from outside by law, by wall, by gate. But what about a confinement so complete, so total, that the people inside it were not merely excluded from the city, but declared by the full authority of the church to be no longer legally alive? That story is waiting just ahead, and it involves a ceremony that I guarantee you have never encountered before, a ritual that was without question the most devastating thing a medieval community could do to one of its own members, not execution. Something in certain ways worse. Stay with me. Let me tell you about a ceremony that the medieval church performed, one that, as far as I can tell, has no parallel anywhere else in human history. It looked like a funeral. The priest wore black vestments. Candles were lit. Prayers were spoken. Scripture was read. The mourners stood in hushed, solemn rows, and at the centre of it all, a person, a living, breathing, fully conscious human being, stood and listened as the church declared them officially, legally, and spiritually dead. They had not committed any crime. They had not been condemned by any court. They had simply developed a disease, and for that medieval European society had devised something arguably more devastating than execution. A ritual called the separatio leprosorum, the separation of the lepers, which stripped a person of every legal right, every social bond, and every civic identity they had ever possessed while they were still standing there in front of everyone they had ever known watching it happen. This is the story of the leprosaria, the leper colonies. And I want to begin by saying something clearly, because there is a great deal of misunderstanding surrounding this subject. The disease that medieval people called leprosy is not the same condition, in every case that we now call leprosy or Hansen's disease. Medieval diagnosis was imprecise at best, and many people who were sent to leprosaria likely had other skin conditions entirely. Psoriasis, severe eczema, even certain fungal infections that simply looked alarming to an untrained eye. Which means that some portion of the people subjected to the separatio leprosorum were not actually ill with the disease the ceremony was designed to address. Think about that for a moment. Declared legally dead for a skin rash. The scale of the leprosarium system in medieval Europe was genuinely staggering. By the 13th century, historians estimate there were somewhere between 19,000 and perhaps as many as 20,000 leprosaria operating across the continent. France alone had roughly 2,000. England had several hundred. They existed everywhere, attached to monasteries at the edges of towns along pilgrimage routes, where the charitable impulse of passing travellers could be relied upon to provide some minimal income for their inhabitants. They were not prisons technically, but the distinction between a leprosarium and a prison was for many of their residents essentially academic. Here is how the separatio leprosorum actually worked, because the details matter. The ceremony was formalized in various liturgical manuals, and while it varied somewhat by region and period, the core elements remained consistent across much of medieval Europe. The person diagnosed with leprosy or suspected of having it, which was good enough, would be brought to the church. The priest would perform a kind of mass in their presence using the black vestments of a funeral. The person would sometimes be made to stand in a grave or to have soil symbolically sprinkled over them, as though they were already being buried. Certain manuals specify that the priest was to tell the afflicted person directly, "You are dead to the world, but alive to God." After this, a list of prohibitions was read aloud. The person could no longer enter a church, could no longer enter a mill, a bakehouse, a market, or a tavern, could no longer touch a well or a fountain or anything that others might touch afterward, could no longer walk down a narrow street or path where they might brush against a passer-by, could no longer eat or drink with any person who was not also a leper, could no longer speak to a healthy person except from downwind. They were given a bell or sometimes a clapper, a wooden rattle, which they were required to sound whenever they approached a public space to warn people of their presence. The bell of the leper is one of the most haunting sounds in all of medieval history. It meant, "I am coming. Step aside. I am no longer one of you." And then they were taken to the leprosarium, and the gates, if there were gates, closed behind them. Now, I've been thinking about this for years, and there is something I keep coming back to that I find genuinely difficult to resolve. The medieval church, the same institution that designed and conducted the separatio leprosorum, also taught that leprosy was a sacred disease, that lepers were in a special relationship with God, that their suffering on earth was a form of purification that placed them closer to holiness than ordinary healthy sinners. The leper in this theological framework was simultaneously the most excluded and the most spiritually elevated member of medieval society. It is a contradiction so complete that it almost becomes darkly comic. You are declared dead. You are expelled from human society. You must ring a bell so that others can flee from you. And also you are blessed. God loves you especially. Your suffering is a gift. I suspect the people living in the leprosaria had mixed feelings about that particular gift. What was daily life actually like inside these places? The evidence we have is fragmentary. Leprosarium residents left fewer records than almost any other group in medieval history for obvious reasons. But what survives paints a picture of extraordinary variety. Some leprosaria were genuinely well-funded institutions endowed by wealthy nobles or bishops who saw charity toward lepers as a spiritually meritorious act. The leprosarium of Grand-Beaulieu near Chartres in France was established in the 12th century, with a proper chapel, individual cells, a garden, and a functioning administrative structure. Residents there had better material conditions than many free peasants living outside the walls. Others were essentially nothing. A few huts at the side of a road, minimal food, no medical care of any kind, entirely dependent on the charity of travellers passing by. The bell in these places was less a warning and more a form of begging, ring it and hope that someone drops a coin or a crust of bread within reach. And the communities themselves developed rich internal lives that the outside world knew almost nothing about. Leprosaria had their own rules, their own internal hierarchies, their own forms of governance. Some had elected leaders, some had their own Saints' Day celebrations. Residents formed relationships, had children, raised families. Yes, children were born in leprosaria. Children who might themselves be entirely healthy, and yet found themselves growing up inside walls that had been designed to contain illness. What happened to those children is one of the genuinely unresolved questions of leprosarium history. Some sources suggest they were eventually released into the wider world when their health was sufficiently established. Others suggest they remained. The records are, as so often happens with the lives of people that mainstream society preferred not to think about, incomplete. There is a figure from English history who spent time among the lepers of the Middle Ages that I find particularly striking, Francis of Assisi, who was not English, but whose encounter with leprosy has been so well documented that it deserves mention here. Before his religious conversion, Francis encountered a leper on a road near his hometown, and by his own account was overwhelmed by revulsion. He turned away. But something made him turn back. He embraced the man, and that moment, that physical embrace of the person his entire culture had taught him to flee, became the pivotal event of his spiritual biography. Francis himself described this encounter as the moment everything changed, the moment the world as he had understood it flipped inside out, and what had seemed repulsive became, in his words, sweetness. He spent years afterward tending to lepers personally, and the early Franciscan movement placed care for the leprous explicitly at the centre of its mission. I find that story remarkable not because it is saintly. Francis was indeed canonized, which puts him in a somewhat unusual category, but because it illustrates something true about the nature of stigma and proximity. The leprosarium system was built on distance, on the bell that said "do not come close," on the ceremony that said this person is no longer present in your world, and every so often someone refused that distance, walked toward the bell instead of away from it, and discovered a full human community on the other side. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the incidence of leprosy in Europe was declining significantly. Historians debate why, with theories ranging from increased immunity in the population to the role of tuberculosis, which may have provided cross-immunity to the leprosy bacillus. As the disease retreated, many leprosaria were converted to other uses: hospitals for plague victims, later poorhouses and general hospitals. The last dedicated leprosarium in England at Highgate in London was repurposed in the 16th century. The bells fell silent, the gates opened, and the communities inside dispersed back into a world that had quite genuinely been pretending they did not exist. It strikes me sitting with all of this that the leprosarium was in some ways the purest expression of a fear that runs through most of the stories we've been exploring in this series. The fear of contagion, not just physical contagion, but social contagion. The fear that proximity to suffering, to difference, to things we do not understand might somehow compromise our own safety, our own standing, our own sense of who we are. The medieval solution to that fear was a wall, a bell, and a ceremony of legal death, and it worked in the narrow sense that it separated the feared from the fearing. But it also inevitably created something the architects of the system never quite intended: a community of people who had nothing left to lose, and who therefore built something entirely their own on the other side of the wall. That theme of people with nothing building something from nothing takes us next into a landscape that could not be more different from the enclosed, defined, ritually bounded space of the leprosarium. We are heading into open countryside now. into villages and farms that stretched across northern France and the lowlands of what is now Belgium, into fields that had been ploughed by the same families for generations, into a world that looked on the surface like ordinary medieval agricultural life, except that every few months an army would arrive, and then everything that those families had spent a year growing, raising and carefully storing away would be gone, burned or taken or both, and then the army would leave, and the families would start again, for over 100 years. The 100 Years' War was not fought only by knights. It was fought in the soil of every farm that lay between the armies. That story is coming next, and it is one I think you will find cuts rather closer to home than anything a history textbook has ever suggested. Picture this with me for a moment. It is early spring. The frost has finally let go of the ground. You have spent the last 3 weeks behind your ox turning the soil in long, slow furrows, preparing the fields for the season's planting. Your back aches, your hands are split at the knuckles from the cold. But the fields look good. The seed grain is carefully stored. Your children are thin from winter, but alive, and the promise of a harvest. A real harvest, enough to eat, enough to pay the Lord his due, maybe even a small surplus to trade at market, sits in your mind like a small warm flame. And then one morning you hear it. Distant at first. A low trembling sound that you feel in the soles of your feet before you understand what it is. Horses, hundreds of them, and behind the horses men. Thousands of men moving across the landscape with a purposeful efficiency that has nothing whatsoever to do with you except that your fields happen to lie in their path, and your grain store happens to be exactly what they need to keep moving, and your village happens to be made of wood which burns. This is the daily reality that most histories of the 100 Years' War between England and France, which began in 1337 and dragged on with interruptions until 1453, simply do not spend enough time on. The battles are well documented. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. Those names ring down through history taught in schools, celebrated in plays and poems. But the fields around those battlefields, the villages that fed both armies, that were looted by both sides, that rebuilt and were looted again, and rebuilt and were looted again across 6 generations, those people left fewer poems, but they left enough. The military strategy that both English and French commanders employed with depressing regularity was called the chevauchée, from the French word for a mounted raid. And the concept was essentially this, rather than seeking out the enemy's army and engaging it directly, which was expensive and unpredictable. You rode through the enemy's territory and destroyed everything. Crops, barns, mills, villages. You were not trying to kill soldiers. You were trying to destroy the economic and psychological foundation that supported the enemy's ability to fight. You were making the land itself into a weapon. The English chevauchées of the mid-14th century were conducted on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. In 1355 alone, Edward the Black Prince led a raiding force from Bordeaux, in southwestern France, on a march of roughly 250 miles that left, according to contemporary accounts, a corridor of destruction approximately 30 to 40 miles wide. Town after town, village after village, crops burned in the fields, livestock driven away or killed. People who could not flee in time, some of them killed, many more left with nothing. No food, no shelter, no tools, no seed grain for the next planting. And here is the thing I want you to really sit with. This happened year after year after year, not once. Not a terrible isolated event that a community could recover from over time. The same regions of France were subject to raiding in the 1340s, the 1350s, the 1360s. Then a pause. Then again in the 1410s and 1420s, when Henry V of England renewed the war and the whole cycle began again. Entire generations of French peasants in the affected regions grew up knowing that everything they planted and built might be gone before the next harvest. Some of them never planted at all because the effort seemed pointless. Why break your back over fields that an army would torch in 6 months? The economic historians who have studied this period in detail, and it is surprisingly well documented because medieval taxation records are remarkably thorough, have found evidence of entire districts going fallow, villages simply abandoned. Tax records from Normandy and the Île-de-France show communities that went from contributing significant revenues to the crown in the early 14th century to contributing essentially nothing by the 1420s and 1430s. Not because the tax was reduced, because there was nothing left to tax. Can I share something that I think captures this period in a way no statistic quite manages? There is a document from the mid-15th century, a petition submitted to the French king by the inhabitants of a village in the Beauce region, the fertile agricultural heartland south of Paris, in which the villagers describe their situation after decades of war. They write that their village, which had once supported 80 households, now contained 12 families. The rest had died or fled. The church had no roof. The mill had been burned twice. The well had been deliberately fouled by passing soldiers, and they were asking not for money, not for relief, but for one specific thing, a reduction in their taxes so that the 12 families remaining could afford the seed grain to plant the fields and have some hope of surviving the coming winter. 12 families, where 80 had lived, asking for enough to just begin again one more time. What strikes me about that document, and I have read a number of similar petitions from this period, is its almost complete absence of self-pity. These were people describing catastrophic suffering in the same matter-of-fact tone that you or I might use to describe a delayed flight or a plumbing problem. The church has no roof. The mill has been burned. We need seed grain. It reads less like a complaint and more like a technical report filed by people who have simply run out of the emotional energy that self-pity requires. They have been surviving for so long in such relentless and grinding circumstances that even their distress has become efficient. Now here is something that most people get wrong about the 100 Years' War, and I say this as someone who has spent a fair amount of time puzzling over this period, and it is this: the popular image of medieval warfare is dominated by knights, armoured men on horseback fighting each other according to codes of chivalry, taking valuable prisoners for ransom, occasionally slaughtering infantry and peasants, but doing so as a kind of backdrop to the real drama of aristocratic conflict. The reality was considerably messier. By the second half of the 100 Years' War, the armies operating in France were increasingly made up, not of disciplined knights following clear orders from a single commander, but of what the period called free companies, bands of soldiers, many of them English or Gascon mercenaries, who had been hired to fight but were not being paid regularly. When the fighting paused during truces, during negotiations, during the winter months, these companies did not go home. They went somewhere. And somewhere meant the nearest village that had not yet been stripped bare. The free companies operated without any of the nominal restraints that even the chevauchée was supposed to observe. They were not making strategic calculations about economic damage to the enemy. They were simply taking what they needed or what they wanted from whoever had it. The routiers, as they were called in French, the roadmen, became in certain regions of France during the 1360s and 1370s a terror as severe as any formal military campaign. Villages in Burgundy and Auvergne in the Rhône Valley paid protection money to free companies in the same way that a small business might pay protection to organised crime, because the alternative was having the building burned down. And here is the detail that I find both grimly fascinating and historically significant. Some regions of France during this period effectively ceased to have a functioning money economy at all. When a village has been looted so many times that there is no money left, and when the lord who is supposed to protect you in exchange for your labour and taxes is himself a refugee or a corpse, the entire feudal system that structured medieval European life simply stops working. What replaces it is barter, mutual aid, subsistence farming, and a profound distrust of anyone outside your immediate community, a distrust that, according to some historians, shaped the political culture of certain French regions for centuries afterward. There is a direct line, some scholars argue, from the experience of rural France during the 100 Years' War to the deep suspicion of central authority, the preference for local governance, and the fierce attachment to community autonomy that characterized French peasant politics well into the 19th century. The trauma, in other words, did not end when the war ended. It got written into the culture, into the way people organized themselves and understood their relationship to power, and it persisted long after anyone alive could remember the original experience that produced it. I think about that sometimes when I read about political movements that seem to outside observers irrational in their intensity, their distrust of governments, their refusal to cooperate with institutions, their insistence on self-sufficiency above all else. How much of what looks like stubbornness or irrationality is actually memory? Not personal memory, but cultural memory, the accumulated weight of generations of experience that taught certain communities very clearly and very consistently that the people with the power were the people with the horses, and the people with the horses were coming to take your grain. The answer is probably more than we think. From the open fields of France, burning under a summer sky, we move now to a place that is equally exposed but entirely different in character. A place where the enemy is not an army but an industry, where the thing being taken is not your grain but your health, your lungs, your years extracted slowly and methodically in exchange for wages that barely kept a family alive, where the children worked not with a clapper bell or a farming tool but in tunnels so narrow their small bodies were the only ones that fit. The tanning district of medieval London, Paris and Cordoba are next, and I want to warn you gently, this one involves some smells, metaphorical smells, but vivid ones. Prepare yourself accordingly. Alright, I did warn you. So here is a question to ease us in gently before things get genuinely unpleasant. When you walk through a city today, any city anywhere in the modern world, do you ever notice that certain neighborhoods feel different from others? Not just architecturally different, not just economically different, but different in some deeper, more structural way, as though the city itself has a memory of what used to happen there, even when the buildings have changed and the people have moved on. Medieval cities had that quality in a very literal sense. The geography of a medieval European city was not random. It was organized ruthlessly, deliberately organized around the logic of smell, noise, and contamination. The things that were useful to the city but unpleasant to live near were pushed to the edges, and the people who did those useful, unpleasant things were pushed there with them into neighborhoods that the city needed but preferred not to think about too carefully. Nowhere was this more true than in the tanning districts, and the reason I want to tell you about them is not simply because they were unpleasant, though they were comprehensively and in multiple dimensions unpleasant. It is because the tannery districts are one of the clearest windows we have into how medieval European cities organized inequality, how they turned a necessity into a stigma, how they built the class system into the very geography of the street. Let us start with what tanning actually was and why it mattered so much. Leather was to the medieval world what plastic is to ours. It was everywhere in everything. Shoes, belts, saddles, harnesses, armour, book bindings, water pouches, buckets, the hinges on doors, the padding inside helmets. If you were a person alive in medieval Europe, you were surrounded by leather from the moment you woke up to the moment you went to sleep. The demand for it was constant and enormous, and meeting that demand required an industry that was at every stage of its process deeply, thoroughly and inventively disgusting. Here is how leather was made in the medieval period, and I'm going to describe this in some detail because the details matter for understanding why tannery workers lived the lives they did. It began with the raw hide, the skin of an animal, usually a cow, sometimes a deer or a sheep, fresh from the slaughterhouse. The first problem with fresh hide is that it begins to rot almost immediately. So the tanner's first job was to prevent decomposition long enough to process the skin. The method they used was to soak the hide in a solution of water and lime calcium hydroxide for several weeks. This stopped the rotting, but it also made the hide swell and soften in a way that required the next step, removing every trace of hair, fat and flesh from the surface by hand using scrapers and knives. This was done with the hide stretched on a wooden frame, the worker leaning into it hour after hour, day after day. Once the hide was scraped clean, it needed to be softened further and preserved. And here is where medieval tanning reveals a particular creativity that I genuinely admire, even as it turns my stomach. The primary softening agent used in European tanneries for most of the medieval period was urine, specifically aged urine collected from households in the neighbourhood, stored in large vats and allowed to ferment for weeks. The chemical process involved is actually sound. The ammonia in aged urine breaks down certain proteins in the hide and helps relax the fibre structure. It works, but it works while smelling exactly as you would expect a large vat of fermented urine to smell, which is to say, aggressively. And then came the brains. Certain stages of leather processing, particularly for softer grades of leather used in gloves or fine bookbinding, required the hide to be worked with animal brain matter rubbed in by hand, worked into the fibres, because the fats and enzymes in brain tissue produced a suppleness that other methods could not quite replicate. Tanneries kept stocks of brain matter from the same slaughterhouses that supplied their hides. The vats of brain material sat alongside the vats of urine, alongside the pits of tan bark solution, a deep brown liquid made from crushed oak bark that gave the industry its name and completed the actual preservation process. And together they created an olfactory environment that visitors to medieval tanning districts described with a consistency that leaves no room for doubt about its character. The historian Richard Corbin, who has written extensively about the history of smell in French cities, cites accounts from 16th century Paris describing the tanneries along the left bank of the Seine as producing an odour that was detectable from a mile away on warm days. Residents of nearby neighbourhoods petitioned city authorities repeatedly across decades to have the tanneries moved. The tanneries were not moved. They were, however, gradually pushed further and further toward the urban periphery, as cities expanded always at the edge, always downstream, always where the wind and the water could carry the problem away from people wealthy enough to object. In London, the tanning district was concentrated in Bermondsey south of the Thames, an area that not coincidentally was outside the formal jurisdiction of the City of London, and therefore subject to fewer regulations and less civic oversight. The tanners of Bermondsey worked in conditions that no city guild would have formally sanctioned, and they lived in the same district where they worked because they could not afford to live anywhere else, and because, frankly, after years of working in a tannery, the smell becomes something you carry with you wherever you go in ways that make neighbours in other districts less than enthusiastically welcoming. In Córdoba in southern Spain, which was during the medieval period, one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe under Moorish rule, the tanning district was located in the northern part of the city, precisely positioned so that the prevailing winds carried the smell away from the main residential and commercial areas. The Córdoba tanneries were simultaneously among the most technically advanced in Europe, producing leather of exceptional quality that was traded across the continent and among the most dangerous workplaces on the continent. Tanners in Córdoba suffered from a range of chronic health conditions that we would now recognize immediately: respiratory disease from the fumes of the tanning pits, skin conditions from constant contact with lime urine and tannin solutions, and a particular vulnerability to anthrax which lived in animal hides and could be transmitted to anyone who handled raw skins without the protection that medieval workers simply did not have. Anthrax. In leather workers. This is not a medieval exaggeration. Cutaneous anthrax, the form transmitted through skin contact with infected animal hides, was documented in tanneries across Europe well into the 19th century, when it was finally identified and named. Medieval tanners had no idea what it was, only that certain workers developed terrible skin lesions that sometimes spread and sometimes killed. They called it various names in various languages. None of the names helped. There was no treatment. You either recovered or you did not, and either way you went back to work because there was no alternative. Now I want to draw your attention to something that I think is often overlooked when we talk about the dangerous trades of the medieval period. It is easy to frame this as a story about the ignorance of the past. They did not know about germ theory. They did not have protective equipment. They did not understand the mechanisms of disease transmission. All of that is true. But it misses a more important point, which is this: the people who ran tanneries knew perfectly well that tannery workers got sick and died younger than other people. This was not a secret. It was visible, documented, commented upon. And the system continued anyway, because the people getting sick were not the people who owned the tanneries. This is the mechanism at the heart of the tanning district story. And it is the same mechanism you can find at the heart of almost every occupational health crisis in history, from the lead mines of Roman Britain to the cotton mills of Victorian England to the chemical plants of 20th century America. The people who bear the cost of an industry and the people who collect its profits are rarely the same people. And when they're not the same people, the costs have a remarkable tendency to remain invisible, right up until the moment they become impossible to ignore. The tanners of medieval Europe, in London, in Paris, in Cordoba, in the Rhine Valley towns of Germany, in the tanning centres of northern Italy, were at the absolute bottom of the urban social hierarchy. They were essential to the city's economy. Their product was woven into every aspect of medieval life. And they lived in the districts the city had essentially designed to be unlivable downstream, downwind outside the gates, where possible packed into housing that was as close to the pits as possible, because proximity to the work was the only thing that kept the cost of getting to it manageable. Their children grew up breathing tannery air. Their water came from the same streams that the tanning pits drained into. Their expectation of a life was, by the evidence we have, shorter than almost any other urban trade group, and their trade was hereditary in the way that most medieval trades were hereditary, not by law in most places, but by the practical reality that if you were born in a tanning district to a tanning family in a tanning neighbourhood, your options for becoming something else were almost non-existent. There is one more detail about the tannery districts that I keep returning to, and it is a small one, but I find it oddly moving. The tanners of medieval Europe developed within their districts extremely tight community bonds. Guilds where they existed tended to be fiercely loyal to their members, not in the wealthy, politically powerful way of the great merchant guilds, but in the mutual aid sense. If your vats were damaged by a flood, your neighbours helped you rebuild them. If you were sick and could not work, your fellow tanners covered for you. If you died, the community raised your children. The same conditions that made the tanning district one of the most miserable places in the medieval city also made it one of the most genuinely communal. There is something in that, something about what shared adversity does to people who choose to stay, that I find worth sitting with for a moment. From the dark, pungent streets of the tanning district, we move now to a place that is in some ways the tannery's philosophical opposite. Where the tannery was at the city's edge, peripheral, stigmatized, hidden, our next destination was right at the centre of things, literally at the centre on an island in the middle of a river, at the heart of the most powerful city in northern Europe. And yet the people who lived there were in their own way just as trapped, just as forgotten, and just as far outside the protection of the society that surrounded them as any tanner in Bermondsey or Cordoba. We are crossing the Thames now, and the things that happened on that south bank in the taverns and the prisons and the dark little rooms of medieval London's most lawless district are stranger and more human than any story of battles or plague that we have told so far tonight. Cross the Thames with me. It is a grey London morning sometime in the 15th century. You're standing on London Bridge, the only bridge across the river, a remarkable structure lined on both sides with shops and houses so densely built that crossing it feels less like crossing a river and more like walking through a particularly narrow and chaotic street that happens to have water beneath it. On the north side of the bridge is the City of London proper, its laws, its guilds, its Lord Mayor, its walls that have stood since the Romans built them. A city with rules, with courts, with civic structures that, imperfect as they were, at least existed. Now you step off the south end of the bridge, and you are somewhere else entirely. Welcome to Southwark. And I want you to understand something about this place that is easy to miss if you are only looking at a map. Southwark was not a lawless district because nobody cared about it. It was lawless by design. Deliberately, carefully, almost architecturally lawless. Because the City of London, that orderly, regulated, guild-controlled city on the North Bank, needed somewhere to put all the things it wanted to use but did not want to acknowledge. And Southwark, sitting just outside the city's jurisdiction, just beyond the point where London's laws technically applied, was the perfect place for exactly that. The institution that perhaps best captures what Southwark was about, its contradictions, its cruelties, its strange internal logic, is the Marshalsea prison. And the Marshalsea is where I want to begin tonight, because what happened inside it is one of the most genuinely bizarre and humanly complicated stories in the entire history of medieval and early modern London. The Marshalsea was established in the 14th century originally to house prisoners of the royal court people who'd committed offences against the crown or its officers. Over time, its population shifted significantly, and by the later medieval period and into the Tudor era, it had become primarily a debtor's prison. This is where people who owed money and could not pay were sent, which sounds on the surface like a straightforward enough arrangement. You owe money you cannot pay, you go to prison until you can. Simple if harsh. But here is the detail that transforms the Marshalsea from a merely unpleasant institution into something almost philosophically absurd. Debtors in the Marshalsea were required to pay for their own imprisonment. Let that settle for a moment. You have been sent to prison because you do not have money, and now you must pay the prison for the privilege of being imprisoned. You must pay for your cell, a larger payment for a better cell, a smaller payment for a space in the communal ward, nothing if you had nothing, in which case you slept on the floor of a common room with everyone else who had nothing. You paid for your food, you paid for fuel in winter, you paid for the most basic necessities of survival, and if you had family, a wife, children, there was in practice nowhere else for them to go. So they came into the Marshalsea with you. I want to pause on that. Entire families living inside a debtor's prison, not as prisoners themselves, not formally charged with anything, but because their husband or father had been taken in for debt, and the alternative, a woman alone with children in 15th or 16th century London, with no income, no legal status, independent of her husband, and no family nearby, was arguably worse than the prison. So they stayed. And the children of debtors grew up inside the Marshalsea walls, playing in the prison yard, attending, if they were lucky, a small prison school that charitable visitors sometimes organised, eating whatever their parents could scrape together from the inadequate prison rations, supplemented by whatever food friends or relatives brought in from outside. The Marshalsea had a gate, and that gate, unlike the locked gates of the leprosarium we discussed earlier, was not permanently sealed. Debtors who could demonstrate they had no assets whatsoever, who had essentially nothing left to lose, were sometimes permitted to leave the prison during daylight hours to beg or to work odd jobs as long as they returned before the gate closed at night. These were called the rules, the boundaries within which a prisoner might move with relative freedom during the day, under the implicit understanding that there was nowhere else to go, and the prison would be there at nightfall regardless. It produced a peculiar kind of semi-liberty. A man might spend his mornings on the streets of Southwark, begging or running small errands for pennies, and his evenings back in the Marshalsea handing over whatever he had earned to pay for the next day's food and lodging. His debt, meanwhile, continued to accumulate interest in the hands of whoever had put him there. The chance of actually paying it off, of earning enough through begging and odd jobs while simultaneously paying for his own imprisonment, was in most cases essentially zero. This is the mechanism that strikes me as genuinely monstrous when I allow myself to think about it clearly. The debtor's prison was not designed to resolve debt. It was designed to hold people in a state of suspended financial ruin, generating fees for the prison keepers at every stage, while their original creditors, who had the legal right to keep them imprisoned until the debt was paid, waited for a resolution that the system itself made structurally impossible. In a functioning world, a creditor who was owed money would have a strong incentive to find a way to get that money paid. In the world of the Marshalsea, the creditor often simply waited because keeping the debtor imprisoned was its own form of satisfaction, and because releasing them without payment would mean acknowledging a loss. People spent years in the Marshalsea, decades occasionally. Some died there. Now Southwark was much more than a single prison. The district was in many ways a complete alternative city, a shadow version of London that operated on different rules, catered to different needs, and housed populations that the City of London proper had neither room for nor interest in accommodating. The Winchester geese, a term that referred to the women who worked in the licensed establishments of Southwark, so called because the Bishop of Winchester owned much of the land in the district and collected rent from the brothels operating on his property. Yes, the Bishop of Winchester let that sink in, were a significant part of the district's economy and population. The bear-baiting arenas were there, the bull-baiting rings, the cockfighting pits, the taverns that served the workers who crossed the bridge from the city for entertainment that the city's laws would not permit within its walls, and the theatres, because it is worth remembering that William Shakespeare's Globe Theatre was built in Southwark in 1599, not in the City of London specifically, because Southwark was outside the jurisdiction of the city authorities, who periodically tried to ban theatrical performances as immoral. The same district that housed a debtor's prison and a bear-baiting ring also housed what became arguably the most important theatrical venue in the history of the English language. That is Southwark in a nutshell, really. Everything the city wanted and did not want to admit it, wanted all crammed together on the south bank of the Thames, operating under the minimal oversight of the Bishop of Winchester and the Duchy of Lancaster, and various other jurisdictional authorities who had neither the resources nor the inclination to impose anything resembling order, who actually lived in Southwark, not just the prisoners and the people who served them, not just the workers in the entertainment and vice industries. Southwark was also home to a large population of ordinary working Londoners, craftsmen, river workers, market people, traders who lived there simply because the rents were cheaper than on the North Bank, because the city's strict guild requirements did not apply south of the river, and because a certain kind of person prefers to live somewhere the rules sit a bit more loosely. The housing in Southwark was by every account that survives genuinely terrible. The district was low-lying, prone to flooding from the Thames, its streets often ankle-deep in mud, and worse during winter. Fire was a constant risk as it was throughout medieval London, but in Southwark's more densely packed and less well-maintained housing stock fires moved faster, and the resources to fight them were fewer. Sanitation was, if anything, worse than in the city proper, which is saying something. The same river that provided whatever water the district's residents consumed also served as its primary drainage system, a situation that produced predictable consequences for public health. And yet, and this is the pattern we keep finding wherever we look at the most miserable districts in medieval European cities, Southwark had a community life of real vitality. Its taverns were social institutions, its markets were lively. The seasonal fairs on the south bank drew crowds from across the city. The Tabard Inn in Southwark, the inn from which Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury pilgrims set off on their famous journey in the late 14th century, was a real place, a real inn popular enough that one of the greatest writers in the English language chose it as the starting point for his masterwork, because every reader would immediately understand what kind of place it was and what kind of people gathered there. Chaucer's choice is worth dwelling on for a moment. The Canterbury Tales begins in Southwark because Southwark was the place where all of London's social boundaries dissolved. Knight and miller, nun and merchant, scholar and cook, they all ended up at the same inn on the south bank waiting for the road south to open in the morning. The city's strict social hierarchies, its guild memberships and civic rankings, and carefully maintained class distinctions did not quite reach across the bridge. In Southwark you were whoever you were, and the person next to you was whoever they were, and for a night at least the distance between you was smaller than it would have been anywhere in the city proper. I find that detail Chaucer choosing Southwark specifically as the place where his England in all its variety comes together more eloquent than almost anything a historian could say about the place. The most miserable districts of a city have a habit of being simultaneously the most human. Not despite their difficulties, but because of them. When the props of status and respectability are stripped away by poverty and legal marginality, what remains is people, just people with their stories and their arguments and their hunger for a good meal and a warm fire, and someone to talk to at the end of a hard day. The Marshalsea prison eventually closed in 1842, nearly 5 centuries after its founding. By the 19th century it had become famous largely because of Charles Dickens, whose father was imprisoned there for debt when Dickens was 12 years old. Dickens spent that year visiting his father every day after work, crossing the Borough to the prison, sitting with him in the yard. He never fully recovered from the experience. The Marshalsea appears in various forms in several of his novels, most directly in Little Dorrit, whose heroine was born inside the prison walls and grew up never knowing any other home. Little Dorrit, a child of debt born in the shadow of imprisonment, whose entire understanding of the world was shaped by walls she had never chosen. I think, if I am being honest, that is as precise a symbol as the medieval and early modern period ever produced for what it meant to be poor in an old European city. Not dramatic suffering, not spectacular catastrophe, just walls, and a life built inside them because there was nowhere else to build it. From London's deliberate shadows, our journey takes a sharp turn southward, all the way to France, to a warm and beautiful region that once had its own language, its own culture, its own distinctive way of understanding the world. A region so rich in spirit and in thought that the Church decided it needed to be eliminated. Not reformed, not converted, eliminated. And what followed was one of the most systematic and thorough acts of cultural destruction in medieval European history. The people who ordered it called it crusade. The people who lived through it called it something that has no adequate translation, because the language they spoke was nearly erased along with everything else. We're going to Languedoc next, and the word you need to know before we get there is Béziers. Béziers. Say it aloud just once. Béziers. It is a small word for what happened there, a small soft word for an event so complete, so total in its violence, that it became and has remained for 800 years one of the most quoted moments in the entire history of religious persecution in the Western world. Not because it was the largest, not because it was the most politically significant, but because of a single sentence spoken on a single morning that reveals with a clarity that no historian has ever needed to embellish exactly what happens when an institution decides that an idea is more dangerous than a person. But to understand Béziers, we need to understand Languedoc first. And to understand Languedoc, we need to understand that the medieval world was not as religiously uniform as we sometimes assume. Southern France in the 12th and early 13th centuries was by the standards of its time an extraordinarily sophisticated place. The region stretching from the foothills of the Pyrenees to the lower Rhône valley, speaking a language called Occitan, which is distinct from both French and Spanish, and which produced some of the most beautiful lyric poetry of the medieval period, had developed a culture that was in certain respects more open and more intellectually diverse than anywhere else in Latin Christendom. The courts of the southern nobles hosted troubadours, those poet-musicians whose tradition would eventually influence everything from Italian Renaissance verse to modern popular songwriting. Jewish scholars and Christian philosophers lived and worked in proximity. Arabic learning filtering up from Moorish Spain found receptive audiences in the cities of the south. And running through all of this quietly at first, and then with increasing visibility, was a religious movement that the Roman Church found not merely wrong, but existentially threatening. The Cathars, from the Greek word for pure, believed something fundamentally incompatible with Orthodox Christianity. They believed that the material world, the physical world, the world of flesh and bone and soil and sensation, was not the creation of a good God. It was the creation of an evil one. The true God in Cathar theology was entirely spiritual pure light, pure spirit entirely beyond matter. The soul was a fragment of that divine light trapped in a body it had not chosen in a world built by a lesser and malevolent power, longing to return to its origin. This might sound like an abstract theological disagreement. It was not. It had enormous practical consequences. If the material world is evil, then the sacraments of the Roman Church, baptism with water, communion with bread and wine, anointing with oil, marriage of physical bodies are not means of salvation but elaborate performances using the tools of the enemy. If the physical world is a prison built by a dark god, then the church that claims to mediate between that world and the divine is at best confused and at worst actively complicit in the deception. The Cathar preachers said this openly. In the market squares of Béziers, of Carcassonne, of Toulouse, of dozens of smaller towns and villages throughout the south, they said it to audiences that listened considered and in significant numbers agreed. By the late 12th century, the Cathar movement, called the Albigensians by the church after the town of Albi, had become the dominant religious practice in parts of Languedoc. Not a fringe, not a hidden sect, the dominant practice. Noble families had converted, entire village communities had converted. Some of the most powerful lords of the south were either Cathar themselves or actively protected the Cathar communities on their lands, because those communities were peaceful, productive, and deeply woven into the social fabric of the region. Pope Innocent III watched this development with increasing alarm. He sent legates to the south to negotiate a return to orthodoxy. The negotiations accomplished very little, and then in January 1208, one of those papal legates, a man named Peter of Castelnau, was murdered on the road by a knight in the service of the Count of Toulouse. Whether the Count ordered the killing directly remains a matter of historical debate. What is not a matter of debate is what happened next. The Pope declared a crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, against Christians, against French Christians, against the people of Languedoc. And here is the detail that makes the Albigensian Crusade unlike almost any other military campaign in European history. The Pope offered the same spiritual rewards, full remission of sins guaranteed salvation to anyone who joined this crusade as to anyone who travelled to Jerusalem to fight. but this crusade was much cheaper and much closer. The Holy Land required months of dangerous sea travel and years of campaigning in a hostile climate. Languedoc was right there across the Alps, or through the passes of the Massif Central, full of reportedly wealthy heretical cities just waiting to be taken. The response was immediate and enormous. In the summer of 1209, a crusading army estimated at somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 soldiers, an enormous force for the period moved south toward the city of Béziers. The city had a population of roughly 10,000 people. The commander of the crusading forces was Simon de Montfort, one of the most capable and ruthless military leaders of the age. Accompanying the army was the papal legate Arnaud Amalric, the Cistercian abbot, appointed by the Pope to oversee the campaign. Béziers was given the opportunity to surrender and hand over its Cathar residents for judgment. The city refused. This was not simply because the Catholics of Béziers, and a significant proportion of the population was Catholic, were indifferent to saving themselves. It was because in Béziers, as in much of Languedoc, the social bonds between Cathar and Catholic families had become so deeply intertwined that many of the city's Catholic residents genuinely could not or would not separate themselves from their Cathar neighbours and relatives. What happened next was recorded by multiple witnesses, including the papal legate himself. The crusading soldiers breached the city's defences, and then they killed everyone. Every person inside the walls of Béziers, regardless of religion, regardless of age, regardless of any attempt to distinguish combatant from civilian or heretic from orthodox believer. The churches and the people who had fled into them seeking sanctuary were burned. Contemporary accounts record the killing of somewhere between 7,000 and 20,000 people. The exact number is unknown and debated, but the fact of the total massacre is not. Béziers was not captured. It was erased, and the phrase that has echoed for 8 centuries through every discussion of religious violence, of institutional extremism, of the point at which an ideology consumes its own humanity entirely. When Arnaud Amalric was asked by the soldiers, according to a source written shortly after the event, how they were to distinguish the heretics from the faithful inside the city, he reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will recognize his own. Caedit ios, novitenim dominus qui sunt ius. Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether Arnaud Amalric spoke those exact words, historians disagree. The source is not a direct eyewitness account. But here is what is not in dispute: the massacre at Béziers happened. Everyone inside the city was killed. And Arnaud Amalric, writing his own letter to Pope Innocent III, describing the campaign, recorded with evident satisfaction that neither age nor sex nor status had been spared. He framed this not as a moral failure or a tragic excess. He framed it as a success. The Albigensian Crusade did not end at Béziers. It continued for 20 years, grinding through city after city across Languedoc. Carcassonne fell. Minerve fell. The people of Montségur, the last major Cathar stronghold, were burned alive en masse in 1244 after a siege of nearly a year. Historians estimate that the population of Languedoc fell by somewhere between 15 and 25% over the course of the Crusade. Some estimates go higher, but here is the part of this story that I find most quietly devastating, and that I think most people do not know. The Crusade itself ended, the armies went home, and then the Inquisition arrived to finish what the armies had started. The medieval Inquisition, the formal institution established by the papacy specifically in response to the Cathar challenge, was not, as popular imagination sometimes suggests, primarily about torture and spectacle. It was about something in some ways more thorough and more patient systematic interrogation record-keeping, and the slow, methodical identification and judgment of anyone who had ever expressed sympathy for Cathar ideas, attended a Cathar ceremony, offered shelter to a Cathar preacher, or known someone who had. The Inquisition's records from Languedoc, many of which survive in archives to this day, constitute one of the most detailed documents of ordinary medieval life in existence, because the inquisitors asked everyone about everything, and the notaries wrote it all down. Those records tell us the names of ordinary people. Farmers and weavers and innkeepers questioned about their neighbours, their relatives, their own private beliefs. They tell us about a woman named Guillemette Benet, who gave a piece of bread to a Cathar preacher passing through her village in the 1310s and was imprisoned for it. About a man named Pierre Marie, who was a shepherd who moved his flocks across the Pyrenees twice a year and who sheltered the last wandering Cathar believers in the mountains because he believed in what they taught, and because he was by all the evidence simply a decent and loyal man. Pierre Marie was questioned multiple times by the Inquisition over many years. He survived. He was one of the last people on record with direct connection to the living Cathar tradition. The last known Cathar perfectus, the highest grade of Cathar believer, someone who had received the ritual of spiritual purification called the consolamentum, was a man named Guillaume Bellebaste. He was burned at the castle of Villarouge-Termenez in 1321. He was betrayed by a man who had posed as a fellow believer for months. With his death, the Cathar Church, which had once been the dominant religion of an entire region, which had produced its own theology, its own clergy, its own distinctive understanding of the sacred, ceased to exist as a living tradition. A language nearly died with it. Occitan, the language of the troubadours, the language of Guillemette Benet and Pierre Marie and Guillaume Bellebaste, was suppressed and marginalised in the decades following the Crusade as French royal authority extended southward. It survived impoverished and diminished as a spoken language in rural communities. It was not until the 19th century revival movement known as the Félibrige that serious efforts were made to restore it to literary dignity. Today, Occitan is classified by linguists as a vulnerable language still spoken by some hundreds of thousands of people. In southern France, still taught in some schools, still sung in some choirs. But the civilizational depth it once represented the courts of the troubadours, the theological richness of the Cathar movement, the open and cosmopolitan culture of 12th century Languedoc that is gone, in ways that cannot be entirely recovered. I sit with that sometimes. Not just with the scale of the violence, though the scale was enormous, but with the specific character of what was targeted. It was not only people who were destroyed at Béziers and Montségur and in 100 smaller atrocities across Languedoc. It was a way of thinking, a way of understanding the sacred that differed from the institutional consensus, a culture of inquiry and openness that had made one corner of medieval Europe genuinely unusual in its tolerance for difference. The Crusade and the Inquisition together eliminated not just the Cathars, but the broader conditions, the noble protection, the civic tolerance, the cultural openness that had allowed the Cathars to flourish. And when those conditions were gone, Languedoc was no longer quite what it had been. It became more thoroughly than before just another province of the French crown, obedient, orthodox, forgetting. The salt of that loss, the salt of everything that was burned and silenced and slowly erased, drifts southward from Languedoc across the Pyrenees and down toward the sea. And it carries us naturally and inevitably to the last truly miserable place we need to visit tonight. A place at the very edge of the known world where the land runs out and the ocean begins, and where people built their lives at the absolute margins of everything, not because they were forced there by armies or laws or disease, but because the margin was what they had always known, and because staying at the edge of the world had shaped them into something that no more comfortable location could quite have produced. Finistère is waiting, and the story of Europe's last village before the ocean is in many ways the most human story of all. The name itself is a kind of poetry, Finistère, from the Latin finisterre, the end of the earth, the place where the land stops and the ocean begins and there is nothing beyond it, nothing at all as far as anyone in the medieval world knew, except water and wind and the edge of whatever God had made. There are several places in Europe that carry this name or its local equivalent. Cape Finisterre on the northwestern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, jutting into the Atlantic from the coast of Galicia, Spain. The Finisterre region of Brittany in northwestern France, and then further north, much further north, the islands and headlands and storm-battered shorelines of the Orkney and Shetland archipelagos, the far coasts of Ireland, the Norwegian fjords that reach down toward the sea like stone fingers, each one ending in a small cluster of houses that seems from any reasonable perspective to have no earthly business being there at all. I want to spend this part of our evening at the far edges, not in the cities, not in the valleys, not in any of the places that medieval European society considered central to its civilization, but out at the margins, the literal geographical margins where the communities that built their lives on the edge of the known world developed a relationship with hardship, so intimate, so long practiced, that it became indistinguishable from identity. And I want to begin with a question that I think is genuinely underexplored in most discussions of medieval hardship. What does it do to a person, to a community, to a culture, to live somewhere that actively tries to kill you every winter? Not metaphorically, physically. Where the cold is not an inconvenience but a predator, where the sea that gives you your food is also the thing most likely to take the people you love, where isolation is not a state of mind but a geographical fact. 6 months of the year when the weather makes it impossible to go anywhere or receive anything from outside. The Norse and Gaelic communities of the far North Atlantic coast lived this reality for centuries, and the world they built inside it is, to my mind, one of the most remarkable and least celebrated chapters in the entire story of European civilization. Let us start with the practical reality of winter in the Northern Islands. The Orkney and Shetland archipelagos sit at roughly the same latitude as Bergen in Norway and Juneau in Alaska. Winter daylight at that latitude runs to about 6 hours at its shortest. The storms that come off the North Atlantic between October and March are not the polite, manageable storms of more southerly latitudes. They are events. They are multi-day affairs with winds that have been clocked in modern times at well over 100 miles per hour, with seas so heavy that even today, with modern forecasting and modern vessels shipping in those waters, requires serious consideration. In the medieval period there was no forecasting. There was only the sky and what you had learned from your parents about what certain skies meant, and whether you had the judgment and the luck to make the right call before the weather changed its mind. Fishing communities in Shetland, the islands, had been settled by Norse immigrants from around the 9th century, gradually blending with earlier Pictish populations, organised their lives around a seasonal rhythm that left almost no margin for error. Summer was for fishing, for preserving, for storing, for every activity that required daylight and relatively calm seas. Summer was when you built or repaired your house, when you cut and dried the peat that would keep you alive through winter, when you grew whatever the thin, rocky, wind-scoured soil of the islands could support, which was not much, primarily oats and kale, with the sea providing the protein that the land could not. And then winter arrived, and the world contracted to the size of your house. The traditional Shetland longhouse of the medieval period was a structure of considerable ingenuity and absolute functional ruthlessness. It was built low to the ground, deliberately low, because the wind at that latitude would simply dismantle anything that offered it too much resistance. The roof was weighted with stones. The walls were thick, built from the rough granite and sandstone of the islands, packed with turf for insulation. The single interior space housed both the family and their animals, not from a lack of refinement, not from ignorance, but from the entirely logical understanding that the body heat of cattle and sheep was a non-trivial contribution to the thermal environment of a space that would otherwise require burning more fuel to stay above freezing. Let me be specific about the fuel situation because I think it is one of the most underappreciated constraints on life in the far north. Shetland has essentially no trees. The islands were deforested in prehistoric times, and the climate, the wind, the thin soil, the salt spray prevents natural regeneration. Every piece of wood on the islands either had to be imported, bought at considerable cost from mainland traders, or salvaged from the sea. Driftwood was a valued commodity, shipwrecks tragic as they were provided timber. The primary fuel for heating and cooking was peat cut from the boggy hillsides in summer, dried over months and stored in quantities that a family's survival through winter depended entirely upon having gotten right. If the summer had been too wet to dry the peat properly, you entered winter with fuel that burned badly, produced more smoke than heat, and ran out sooner than calculated. If your peat store was damaged by autumn flooding, which was not uncommon, you faced winter in a house that could not be adequately heated in a climate where inadequate heating was not a comfort issue but a survival issue. The cold that came off the North Atlantic in January was in an insufficiently heated longhouse capable of killing, and the storms. Let me tell you about what the people of the far north called the Roost, the Pentland Firth. The stretch of water between the Orkney Islands and the Scottish mainland is one of the most dangerous pieces of water in the world. The tidal currents that run through it, combined with the Atlantic swells and the shallow water over certain submarine features, create sea conditions that mariners have documented with consistent horror across many centuries. Whirlpools large enough to be visible from the shore, standing waves that appear and disappear without warning, currents running at speeds that could overwhelm a medieval vessel, even with favourable winds. The communities on either side of the Pentland Firth were fishing communities. They had to cross that water, or waters very much like it, to fish the productive grounds to the north. They did this in small open boats, the traditional Norse-derived fairing and six-areen of the Shetland and Orkney Islands vessels of beautiful construction, light and flexible and extraordinarily seaworthy in competent hands. The men who sailed them had generations of knowledge about the water and the weather, and they still died. Every community along the coast had its years of catastrophe, a sudden storm, a navigational error, a moment's misjudgment, and afterward, a village with too many widows and too many fatherless children, and a winter ahead with not enough men to do the work. The Shetland tradition of the Eapheli Ayar, the midwinter fire festival that survives to this day as one of the largest fire festivals in Europe, has its roots in this reality. The burning of the longship at the centre of the festival is not a random piece of Viking cosplay. It is a ritual acknowledgement of the relationship between these communities and the sea that gave them their livelihood and took their people, the sea that was simultaneously the source of everything and the agent of the most devastating losses any of those small, tight, interdependent communities could experience. I want to stay with the interdependence for a moment because it is central to understanding how these communities survived at all. The margins of the far north were not places where rugged individualism, that famous quality so often attributed to Viking culture in particular, could actually function. Individual families trying to survive alone on the resources of a Shetland croft could not. The unit of survival was the community, the township, the cluster of related and neighbouring families who shared resources, shared labour, shared risk and shared loss in ways that were not optional but existential. When a fishing crew was lost at sea, the community fed the widow and children. When a family's peat store failed, neighbours shared their fuel. When illness struck a household at the wrong moment of the agricultural year, others stepped in to do the work that could not wait. This was not charity in any modern sense. It was a survival mechanism understood by everyone involved to be as necessary as the peat and the fish and the weighted roof. Communities that did not practice mutual aid did not survive on the edge of the North Atlantic. It is that simple. And it produced something. Something that I find worth noting because it challenges a certain assumption that is quietly embedded in how we often talk about harsh environments and the people who lived in them. The assumption is that hardship produces diminishment, smaller lives, thinner cultures, people too busy surviving to think about anything else. The evidence from the far north of medieval Europe tells a more complicated story. The Norse literary tradition, the sagas, those extraordinary prose narratives of family conflict and voyage and settlement and revenge, composed primarily in Iceland between the 12th and 14th centuries, emerge from exactly these conditions. The long dark winters that seem from the outside like the death of all activity were in fact the time when communities gathered, when stories were told and retold and refined, when the oral tradition that eventually became the written tradition was sustained and elaborated. The Eddas, the great collections of Norse mythological poetry, preserve a cosmology of staggering imaginative ambition, a universe of ice and fire and a world tree and a doom, already written into the structure of existence produced by communities that lived for significant portions of the year in the dark. I think about this sometimes when I am tempted to equate discomfort with diminishment. The people of the far northern margins of medieval Europe were not diminished by their conditions. They were shaped by them in ways that produced specific kinds of resilience, specific kinds of solidarity, specific kinds of imaginative depth that more comfortable environments had no reason to generate. This does not make their winters less brutal or their losses less real. It means that the relationship between suffering and human capacity is more complicated, more interesting and more resistant to simple conclusions than we sometimes prefer. The communities of the Shetland and Orkney Islands, of the Irish Atlantic coast, of the Norwegian fjords and the Breton headlands, they are all still there in some form, changed, modernized, connected to the wider world in ways their medieval predecessors could not have imagined. But the memory of what they were is still present in the architecture of the remaining stone longhouses, in the names of the fishing grounds, in the fire festivals, in the specific quality of self-reliance and community loyalty that observers note even today in the cultures of the far north. From this far edge, from this wind-scoured margin, where the land finally runs out, we have one last stop to make before tonight's long journey reaches its end. And it is a strange one because it brings us not to a place of obvious suffering, but to a place of something more paradoxical, a place where the very material that sustained civilization was found in abundance, but where the people who extracted it from the ground lived lives of almost deliberate invisibility. White mountains, white deserts, white gold that everyone needed and almost nobody talked about. The salt workers are waiting, and their story, I think, is going to stay with you in a way that is difficult to explain until you have heard it. Think about the last meal you cooked, or the last meal someone cooked for you. Somewhere in that meal, in the pasta water, in the seasoning, in the preservation of whatever was preserved, there was salt. There is always salt. We are so accustomed to its presence that we have almost entirely stopped noticing it. It sits in a little container on the table. You reach for it without thinking. You put it down without thinking. It costs almost nothing, and its absence from your life is essentially unimaginable. For most of human history, this was not the case. For most of human history, salt was one of the most strategically important substances on Earth. Not a condiment, not a seasoning, a technology. The only technology available to most people for most of the medieval period for preserving food across seasons, for making it possible to eat fish, caught in summer during a winter storm, for keeping meat through the months, when no animal could be slaughtered, for transforming what was perishable into what would last. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, the salt allowance paid to Roman soldiers, because salt was considered valuable enough to use as currency. The phrase, "worth his salt," comes from the same world. Medieval salt taxes, the French gabelle in particular, were so deeply despised that they contributed directly to popular resentment of the crown for centuries, and historians have argued that the injustices of the salt tax were among the grievances that seeded long before the event itself, the French Revolution of 1789. Salt was, in other words, the kind of thing that made and unmade empires, and the people who actually made it, who stood in the sun and the wind and the brine day after day, season after season, extracting this essential substance from sea and stone and earth, those people are almost entirely absent from the histories written about the civilization that salt sustained. Tonight we're going to find them. The salt pans of the Camargue, that extraordinary wetland delta where the Rhône River meets the Mediterranean in the south of France, were among the most productive salt-producing sites in medieval Europe. They were also among the least hospitable places on the continent to spend a working life. The Camargue is not the postcard Provence of lavender fields and stone farmhouses. It is flat, brutally flat in every direction, with no shelter from the wind that comes off the Mediterranean in certain seasons, with a persistence that locals have historically described, with a colourful range of terms, none of them complimentary. The salt workers of the Camargue, the sauniers, as they were called in Occitan, the language we discussed in our previous chapter, worked a process that had changed very little since the Romans had first developed it systematically in the region. Seawater was drawn into shallow evaporation ponds called salines or salins through a system of channels and sluices. The water sat in these ponds through the hot summer months, slowly evaporating under the Mediterranean sun, concentrating the salt content as it went. By late summer, the remaining brine was dense enough that salt crystals began to form on the surface and settle to the bottom of the ponds as a thick, wet crust. And then the harvesting began. Workers waded into the shallow brine on foot, raking the salt crystals into mounds with long wooden rakes. The brine they were wading through was saturated far saltier than the sea, saturated enough that it drew moisture aggressively from any skin it contacted. The workers' feet and legs, submerged for hours at a time in this concentrated solution, developed a specific kind of damage that combined the effects of chemical abrasion, dehydration of the skin layers, and the secondary infections that entered through the resulting cracks and abrasions. Salt workers had almost universally legs that looked decades older than the rest of their bodies. The skin was thickened, discoloured, fissured. In severe cases, the damage extended to the bone, producing the kinds of chronic infections that without modern antibiotics were extremely difficult to resolve. Do you know what the most striking detail about the Camargue salt workers is from a historical standpoint? It is not the physical damage. It is the economics. The salt these workers produced was among the most valuable agricultural commodity in medieval France, taxed heavily by the crown, traded across the Mediterranean, essential to the fishing industries of Brittany and Portugal, and a dozen other regions that could not function without preserved fish. The gabelle, the salt tax, generated revenue for the French crown that historians estimate in certain periods of the 14th and 15th centuries accounted for somewhere between a quarter and a third of total royal income, a quarter to a third of the entire income of the French crown, from salt, which was harvested by people who lived in conditions that the salt merchants and tax collectors who handled that revenue preferred not to examine too closely. The sauniers of the Camargue occupied a position in medieval French society that was structurally similar to what we saw in the tannery districts, essential, economically central, socially invisible. Their villages were at the edge of the wetlands built on the slightly higher ground that the Camargue occasionally offered, subject to seasonal flooding when the Mistral wind drove water in from the sea and the levees failed, which they periodically did. Their diet was heavy on the fish they could catch in the same channels. Where the salt was processed, a sensible arrangement, given that salt and preserved fish were both things they had immediate access to, and a rather grim one given that it meant eating the same thing prepared in the same way for most of your life. The Wieliczka salt mine in Poland offers a dramatically different but equally revealing window into the lives of medieval salt workers. Where the Camargue workers laboured under the open sky, the miners of Wieliczka worked underground, in a mine that had been operating continuously since at least the 13th century, and that by the 14th and 15th centuries had become one of the most economically significant sites in the entire Kingdom of Poland. The mine produced rock-salt solid crystalline deposits formed from ancient inland seas, and it tunnelled deeper and wider with each generation of miners eventually reaching depths and lateral extents that made it in essence a city beneath a city. The miners of Wieliczka worked in conditions that combined many of the worst features of every other environment we have visited tonight. The cold of the northern winters penetrated the upper levels of the mine. The deeper levels were warmer, sometimes uncomfortably so, and the combination of temperature, humidity, and the specific mineral character of the salt environment produced respiratory conditions in long-term miners that were essentially inevitable. Salt dust, unlike coal dust, does not produce black lung disease, but it does produce its own forms of damage to the mucous membranes of the nose, throat, and lungs, and it creates an environment in which infections find easy purchase. The miners also worked by candlelight and torchlight in air that was only as good as the ventilation shafts allowed at depths where a collapse or a flooding event offered minimal chance of survival. The mine flooded repeatedly across its history. Explosive gases accumulated in certain chambers. Rockfalls were not uncommon. The Wieliczka miners had patron saint St. Kinga the Queen, who legendarily discovered the mine, and whose statue, carved entirely from rock salt by the miners themselves, still stands in one of the mine's chapels, and they needed them. Here is what I find most extraordinary about the Wieliczka mine, and what I think says something profound about human beings in general, in the deepest, most inaccessible, most hostile chambers of a mine, where they spent their working lives in darkness and physical danger, medieval Polish miners carved chapels. Not simple niches with a candle. Full chapels with altars and sculptures and relief carvings along the walls executed in the same salt rock that surrounded them. The largest of these, the Chapel of St. Kinga, is a chamber of genuine beauty bas-reliefs, depicting biblical scenes, chandeliers made from salt crystals, a floor of polished salt blocks. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most visited tourist attractions in Poland, drawing over 1 million visitors a year. Those visitors stand in a space that miners created in the hours when they were not working, as an act of devotion and communal expression deep underground, by the light of candles using the material that was simultaneously their work and their prison, and apparently also their art. I have no adequate framework for that. I simply find it extraordinary in the original sense of the word, something so far outside the ordinary that it demands to be acknowledged on its own terms. The salt tax, the gabelle that made French kings wealthy on the backs of Camargue Saunier, was one of the most comprehensively hated institutions in French history. It was not a flat tax. It was a deliberately inequitable tax, varying wildly by region, in ways that produced absurdities. Some regions were required to purchase a minimum quantity of salt per household per year, whether they needed it or not, at prices set by the crown. Smuggling salt, sell faux full salt brought in from regions with lower taxes or from outside France entirely became a widespread industry, and the crown responded with a salt police force, the gabelleurs, who were empowered to search homes, confiscate smuggled salt, and impose penalties that included, in serious cases, galley service. People were sent to row in the royal galleys for the crime of carrying salt. The gabelle was formally abolished in France in 1790, in the first year of the Revolution. It had been in operation in various forms since the 14th century. That is roughly 450 years of a salt tax so deeply resented that its abolition was one of the first acts of a revolutionary government that was simultaneously dismantling the entire ancien regime of the French monarchy. 450 years. And the people who paid most directly for it, not in money but in the bodies of the people who produced the salt that the tax was levied upon, were the Sauniers of the Camargue and the miners of the interior, whose names appear in no history books, whose condition generated no political philosophy and no grand revolutionary rhetoric, and who simply went on raking salt into mounds and wading through brine until they could not any more. I want to leave you with that image for a moment. Not the grand sweep of the Gabelle and its role in revolutionary history, not the UNESCO chapel in the Polish mine, just a person standing knee-deep in brine under a Mediterranean sun with a wooden rake pulling white crystals toward them across a shallow pan of water, surrounded by flat white landscape in every direction with legs that hurt, making the thing that made the meal, that made the civilization that never once, in all its centuries of benefiting from what that person was doing, thought to write their name down. There is something in that invisibility, that systematic, structural, entirely unremarkable invisibility, that runs through almost every story we have told in this series. From the families in the debtors' prison, to the miners of Cornwall, to the Sauniers of the Camargue. The people whose labour and suffering were most essential to the functioning of medieval European civilization were also almost without exception the people that civilization was least interested in seeing clearly, and that brings us to our final stop of the evening. We have travelled from the plague-emptied streets of Siena to the brine pans of the Camargue, from the leper colonies of France to the salt mines of Poland, from the edge of the North Atlantic to the burning fields of the 100 Years' War. We have seen misery in almost every form that medieval Europe could devise, but we have not yet asked the deepest question. The question that ties everything together, that runs beneath all these stories like an underground river. The question that I have been working toward in my own quiet way since the very first minutes of this video. Why did people stay? Why in place after place, in condition after condition, that most of us would consider absolutely intolerable, did generation after generation of ordinary human beings simply remain, continue, build, name their children and repair their boats, and plant their fields again after the army passed through, fill their salt pans again, go back down into the mine in the morning? The answer to that question is the most human thing in this entire series, and it is waiting for us at the end of the earth. At the very edge of the known world there is a lighthouse. It stands on a headland of bare grey granite on the northwestern tip of Spain, where the Galician coast finally gives up its argument with the Atlantic Ocean and simply stops. The lighthouse is modern electricity automated, utterly unremarkable by current standards. But the headland beneath it has been a sacred place, a waymarker, a destination for at least 2,000 years. The Romans called it Promontorium Celticum. The medieval pilgrims who walked the Camino de Santiago, hundreds of thousands of them across centuries, often continued past the tomb of St. James in Compostela, and walked another 90 kilometres to reach this point, because standing at the edge of the world felt to the medieval mind like the closest a living person could come to the threshold of the divine. Cape Finisterre, the end of the earth, and just below the headland in the small sheltered bay that the cape partially protects from the worst of the Atlantic weather, the village of Finisterre itself, a fishing community of perhaps a few hundred people in the medieval period, clinging to the rocks and the sea in a way that has changed less than almost any other aspect of medieval life that we've explored together tonight. I want to use this final place not as another catalogue of specific miseries, though the fishing communities of the Galician coast had their full share, but as a way of answering the question I left hanging at the end of our previous chapter. The question of why people stayed, why they built lives in places that seem by any reasonable calculation to be working against them. Because looking at the village of Finisterre, really looking at it not as a tourist destination or a spiritual waymarker, but as a community of working people across the medieval centuries, I think the answer becomes clearer than anywhere else we have visited. The families who fished the waters off Cape Finisterre in the medieval period were fishing some of the most productive but also some of the most dangerous waters in Europe. The Atlantic off Galicia is not the sheltered Mediterranean. It is deep, cold, unpredictable, and governed by weather systems that can change within hours from calm to genuinely dangerous. The records of maritime disasters off the Galician coast in the medieval period are extensive. Fishing boats capsized, crews drowned, widows raised children alone. Every community along that coast knew as a regular and expected feature of ordinary life the grief of losing someone to the sea. And yet, every morning the boats went out again, not out of ignorance, not out of recklessness, not because these communities had somehow failed to notice what the sea was capable of. They had noticed in the most direct and personal way possible. They went out because the alternative, not fishing, not working the sea, meant not eating, meant the slow, quiet, completely unglamorous extinction of everything they had built. The sea was dangerous, and the sea was also, in the most literal sense, life. You cannot negotiate that kind of relationship. You can only learn it as thoroughly as you can pass that learning to your children and go out in the morning. Here is what I keep coming back to after spending so much time in the most miserable places of old Europe. The question we started with, why did people stay, actually contains a false assumption buried inside it. The assumption is that leaving was a real option, that these communities were choosing their hardship in the way that we in the 21st century can choose to move away from a neighbourhood we do not like, or leave a job that is making us miserable, or simply get in a car and drive somewhere else. For the vast majority of medieval European people, the serfs of the fenlands, the miners of the Harz Mountains, the salt workers of the Camargue, the fishing families of Finisterre leaving was not a choice that was available to them in any meaningful sense. They could not leave because they had nowhere to go, because they had no money to travel, because the law in many cases literally forbade it, because their entire identity, their entire community, their entire understanding of who they were and what they were for was rooted in a specific piece of ground or a specific stretch of water or a specific trade that they had not chosen and could not simply put down. What looks from the outside like extraordinary resilience was often at its core simply the absence of alternatives, and I think it is important to say that clearly without romanticizing it, because the romanticization of poverty and hardship is one of the quiet dishonesties that can creep into historical storytelling if you're not careful. These were not people who had discovered some secret about the human spirit that made suffering bearable. They were people who suffered and kept going because stopping was not an option, and because somewhere underneath all of it, the same thing that makes you watch a video about medieval hardship at this hour of the evening, that stubborn, irrational, beautiful human insistence on wanting to understand, on wanting to connect, on refusing to be entirely alone in the world, that thing was present in them too. But there is something else in the Finisterre story, something that I think does deserve to be called resilience in the real sense of that word, not the poster quote version, but the actual structural thing that allows communities to survive conditions that should by any rational accounting destroy them. The pilgrimage. Consider what it meant to the fishing community at Finisterre that their village was the final destination of one of the most significant spiritual journeys in medieval Europe. Every year, tens of thousands of pilgrims walk the Camino de Santiago from France, from England, from Germany, from as far away as Scandinavia, and a significant portion of them continued to Finisterre to stand at the edge of the world. Medieval pilgrims customarily burn their shoes or their walking boots at the Cape, a ritual disposal of what they had travelled in a symbolic shedding of the journey, and they left offerings. They bought food. They needed lodging. They brought news from everywhere they had come from. For a community at the absolute geographic margin of medieval Europe, as far from any centre of power or commerce as it was possible to be while remaining in Europe at all, the pilgrimage was a thread of connection to the wider world that would otherwise have been almost entirely absent. The village of Finisterre knew every year that the world was going to come to them, that people from places they had never seen and could barely imagine would arrive at their edge of the earth looking tired and blistered and spiritually moved, and would need fish and bread and a place to sleep. That connection matters. I do not want to overstate it. A few months of pilgrim traffic every year does not transform a fishing village at the edge of the Atlantic into a cosmopolitan hub, but the knowledge that you are part of something larger than your own bay, your own weather, your own harvest, that somewhere in directions you can point to but perhaps never travel, there are other people living other lives that eventually lead by roads you could theoretically follow to exactly where you are standing. That knowledge does something to a community's sense of itself. It provides context. It provides meaning. It provides a framework within which even a hard and narrow life can feel not glamorous, not comfortable, but located, placed, part of a larger story. And I think that is perhaps the deepest answer to the question of why people stayed in Finisterre and in all the other places we've visited tonight. Not because they had nowhere else to go, though that was true. Not because they were brave, though some of them surely were. But because the place they lived, however cold or wet or dangerous or unjust, was the place where their story was, where the names on the gravestones were people they had known, where the paths were worn by feet they recognized, where the sea, however treacherous, was their sea known in its moods and its seasons, with an intimacy that no other sea could match. Home in the medieval world was not a comfort concept. It was an identity concept. You were not from a home. You were of a place in a way so total that the place and the person were almost inseparable. And that belonging, that deep, structural, unchosen belonging, was both a trap and a sustaining force, sometimes simultaneously, often impossibly difficult to distinguish between. We have come a long way tonight, from Siena in 1348, emptied of half its people in a single summer, to the brine pans of the Camargue, to the leper colonies, with their bells and their ceremonies of legal death, to the narrow street of the Frankfurt Judengasse, to the burning fields of the 100 Years' War, to the darkness beneath the Harz Mountains, to the lawless south bank of the Thames, to the voices silenced at Béziers, to the longhouses of Shetland, to the salt chapels of Wieliczka, and finally here to a grey granite headland at the end of the earth, where the Atlantic runs west without interruption, all the way to North America, and a few hundred people in medieval boats went out every morning onto that water, because that was what they did, what they had always done, what they would always do. What do we take from all of this? What is the conclusion, if there is one, of a journey through the most miserable places of old Europe? I think it is this. The misery was real, every bit of it. I want to be clear about that because there is a temptation in history, as in life, to reach for a redemptive arc, to find the silver lining in the leprosarium, the inspiring lesson in the plague year, the uplifting takeaway from the massacre at Béziers. And those things can be found if you look hard enough. The chapels carved underground, the culture built inside walls, the sagas composed in the long dark winter. Human beings will make beauty and meaning out of almost anything, and that is genuinely remarkable and worth saying, but it does not cancel the misery. The bodies in the trenches at Siena were real bodies. The family living in the Marshalsea debtors' prison was a real family. The children whose legs were ruined by salt brine were real children. The civilization that benefited from their labour and forgot their names was ours, the same civilization whose cathedrals we visit on vacation, whose political philosophy we quote, whose art we hang in our museums. We are the heirs of all of it, the beauty and the forgetting. What we can do, I suppose, what feels to me like the only adequate response to all of this, is exactly what you have been doing tonight. Paying attention, slowing down enough to actually see the people that history tends to move past quickly, asking not just what happened, but who was there when it happened and what it felt like from the inside and why and what they did with it. The past is not another country, no matter how often we say it is. It is the place we came from. The decisions made in those plague cities and those tannery districts and those burning fields of France shaped the world we've inherited. The patterns of inequality, the mechanisms of exclusion, the ways that power organizes suffering and assigns it to the people least able to refuse it, those patterns were not invented in the medieval period, and they were not confined to it. We live still downstream from Siena, downstream from Béziers, downstream from the Marshalsea and the Camargue, and every other place where ordinary people bore the weight of a civilization that never quite acknowledged their name. I find that thought at the end of a long evening of dark history somehow not depressing but clarifying, because knowing where you came from, really knowing clearly and without the soft focus of nostalgia, or the hard focus of condemnation, is the only way to have any honest sense of where you are. And where you are right now is at the end of a journey. You made it all the way to Finisterre. You stood at the edge of the world and looked out at the Atlantic, and you did not look away from any of the hard things we passed through on the way here. That is not nothing. In fact, I think it is rather a lot. Thank you. Genuinely. For spending this time in these places, for listening this carefully, for caring about people whose names we mostly do not know. It matters that someone does. If tonight's journey has left you thinking or unsettled in the best possible way, or simply wanting to know more, I would love to hear which place stayed with you. Leave it in the comments. Tell me which story stopped you in your tracks, which detail you're going to be thinking about while you brush your teeth tonight. Those conversations are honestly the reason I make these, and if you have come this far without subscribing, well, you know the way. The button is right there, and the next journey is already being planned. I can promise you it is going to take us somewhere you have not been before, to people whose stories deserve exactly this kind of attention, at exactly this hour of the evening when the world is quiet and you have time to actually listen. Sleep well tonight. You have earned it, and the miserable, extraordinary, stubbornly human past will be here waiting when you wake up.